In this video, I'm going to share the process I went through to take a split shot, a raw file of a split shot I took on my Greenland trip, and using Adobe Lightroom Classic CC and Adobe Photoshop, so the latest versions of both. Adjust the photo from one that's not really usable to, if not an award-winning photo, at least a pretty decent one. And it's actually a lot simpler than I thought. So looking at this photo, you'll see there's lots of issues. Above water, it's very washed out, and it's fairly dark below water, and so this was a very difficult photo to take. It was a gray overcast day, but the sky was overall quite bright. Obviously the snow at the top of the iceberg is very bright. And then we had the diver situated in an area that was that we had a gap between the sea ice kind of on the left and the iceberg on the right. I was lying on the sea ice, shooting off the sea ice. And so that area underneath the water, it was getting some light, but not a whole lot. It would be a lot brighter if we didn't have the sea ice off to the left. And so we're dealing with a very large dynamic range here, as well as difficult lighting conditions. So what's it going to take to fix this? Well, there's a few issues. The first thing is we want to brighten or rather darken this this area above water, so at least we can see the iceberg. So it's actually simpler than I expected to do this. We can use something called a gradient filter. So we click here on the gradient filter option, and then I just go to the middle of the photo. I select the area that I want, and then I drag the filter down, and let's just drag it to the bottom of the water layer at the top, and that's the area that we're going to darken. So nothing too fancy here, just need to change the exposure, and let's say dropping it to about minus 2.4 seems about right. Now we can see we're getting some good details up here in the iceberg. Okay, so that's the first step. And another thing I like to do, especially with kind of high range photos, is I like to knock the highlights down to get some more details out. And then just bring up the whites until we're edging up in the histogram about blowing out the top end of what we have in the photo. So that's kind of my adjustments here: highlights down, whites up. And now we've got an iceberg up here between the gradient filter and the highlights adjustment. So the next thing is I'd like this water to be a bit brighter, so I'm going to up the shadows. That's probably too far. And what you'll see, there were a lot of particulates in the water, and so there's quite a bit of backscatter in this case. So that's okay. We'll work on that next. But anyway, so I've increased the shadows up to about plus 46, and then just to make sure that we don't lose too much contrast, I knock the blacks down, so that brings out the diver a bit more. Yeah, so you can see now we've brightened the water. Okay, last thing, I like to add some clarity. And I'll sharpen the image up, and then there's also this function called dehaze, which recently came in, which seems to also sharpen something like this a little better. Okay, so now we're not looking too bad, but we still have this backscatter issue, or not backscatter, there's no strobes used here, but just a particulate issue. The rest of the photo actually looks pretty good at this point. So what I'm going to do, and it's very nice how it's integrated. I can just right click on the photo and go edit in Photoshop. And as we open Photoshop, just a quick disclaimer, I'm no Photoshop expert. I use it for a few functions that I can't get in Lightroom, typically to remove backscatter or particulates, and also to use content-aware fill to get rid of bubbles and get rid of other things that might be in the image. So anyway, so we're opening the image in Photoshop. This is just the way I do it. There might be easier ways, but this way works pretty well for me. So what I'm going to do, right click on the background, and I just duplicate the layer. I call this, typically doesn't really matter, but let's call this Dust and Scratches filter, because that's what we're going to use. Okay, so now I've got this new layer here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply, I'm going to go to the filter option, go to noise, Dust and Scratches, and so what Dust and Scratches does is basically you can set a radius and a threshold for the size of dust or scratch, like the size of particle it will filter out, and it seems like it basically just smooths everything out. So in this case, obviously we don't want to use this for the whole picture, so it will mess it up, as you can see here by the preview. But what I'm looking to do is to smooth out this section of the water selectively. So anyway, this seems to work fine for this. 30 radius is pretty heavy for the Dust and Scratch, but in this case, because it's just a localized area with no real detail other than the color of the water, it'll work fine. So I'm going to go with that. Okay, so now it's applying the filter. Now the next thing to do is to go to the layer option, go to layer mask and hide all. And this is where we still have the Dust and Scratches filter layer selected. Okay, layer mask, hide all. And now this layer is in the background. You can see that from the black image here. So now if we want to bring through the filter, then all we need to do is paint white onto this black layer. And anywhere we paint it, it's going to bring the filter through. Okay. So normally if I'm doing backscatter, you know, I will use this very selectively so we don't lose too much other detail, but with the water, since we're just trying to get rid of it all and there's really no detail behind it other than the color, I'm just going to use a pretty heavy, pretty large brush, and then let's just zoom in a little bit. And now we can work our way along the edges. And now I want to be a bit careful, because if we do apply this this filter to the edges, then it will blur them, which may look funny in the photo. So just kind of go all the way around. And while you're doing this process, if you realize that if it's not taking out some of the particles, then you may need to go back to the filter, the Dust and Scratches filter, and increase the radius threshold. Okay. Okay, that looks pretty good. There's a few bits and pieces here. on the iceberg, that would be nice to clean up as well. So I'll shrink my brush, and then what you can see here, especially in front of the iceberg, is it will actually blur your photo a bit, and that's a result of the pretty heavy usage of the radius on this. But it's overall it will be fairly innocuous once you zoom out. But you just need to be careful about how heavily you use this. So, in front of the diver, it's murky, but that was also an issue with kind of the freshwater layer on top of the that sits on top of the salt water around the iceberg, and just going after this is going to end up blurring out the diver. So I'm okay with how this looks. The water's nice. So let's take a look on the screen. Great. So now I just save it. So you can see here it's added on edit to, and it's a TIFF file. So now I can go back into Lightroom. This is my original. Once it loads up. Sorry, this is the edited file. And this one's here is my basically with Lightroom edits before it's gone into Photoshop. So really that's about it, and that's